May we learn together in hope and joy. Please be seated. I'm going to come to the other side of the cloud. Is there another side of the cloud? Still not on the other side of the cloud. It'll rise eventually. At some point. The prayers of the people are thick tonight. What can I say? And look, if you're about to hear the sermon I'm going to preach, you need thick prayers to get you through it. I was reviewing what I wanted to share with you tonight, and I came to the conclusion that the sermon I had thought about preaching was what we called so elegantly in seminary, dull. Is that what they used in seminary when you were there? No, there was never a dull sermon. So I'm going to give you a bit of brain teaser isn't the right word, but something to think about. So when the sermon gets boring, you can continue to try to answer this, and I'll try to give you the end at the end of the sermon. I frequently like to point out when I think that the editors of the Revised Common Lectionary, that's the readings that we have each Sunday and each every day. Sometimes I look at that and I say, like, what are you thinking? Why did you pick this and this and this? And I say, I think that their reasons were probably not great. Tonight, however, I think the readings, specifically the second reading, is a brilliant compliment to the gospel reading. So I want you to think about that. Why? Well, you can ask this question in two ways. One, why is this such a good compliment to the gospel? Or why does Tyler think this is such a good compliment to the gospel? Which may be very two different things, I assure you, but something to think about. I had a fun experience this past week. I was sitting on the couch with my dog Stanley. I think I've mentioned Stanley before. Stanley, who is made of Velcro and brick, is not the brightest dog. We love, I love him, but not for that particular reason, his intelligence. But I was persuaded by my 17-year-old daughter to watch the movie Wicked. And it's the second part of Wicked. The second part of Wicked. I believe it was 7.5 hours long. Have any of you seen it? Have any of you seen it? No. Well, I discovered something. Part 2. Which is hard to understand when you haven't seen part 1, but it is what it is. And I discovered something about 15 minutes into this movie, and what I discovered is that Stanley seemed to be watching the movie. And 30 minutes in, an hour in, he was enthralled. I took a nap, I woke up, the movie was still going, and Stanley was still focused on the movie. And I could not for the life of me understand what was so interesting that he was, and I thought, is it the music? Is it there were songs? Is it there were bright colors? There were shiny things? I think that's what it was. I think it was the colors and the shininess, because one of the things that I know about Stanley, much like his paternal owner, is that he is easily distracted by shiny things. You can have a conversation, but then all of a sudden you see something and you're like, oh. And then you completely forget whatever else it was, because something shiny has drawn our attention. And something like that can happen on Epiphany. Something like that can happen when we hear our gospel reading, because when we think about the Magi, well, let me ask you, when we think about the Magi, what's sort of the first thing that you think of? Thank you. 2 spiritual answers, and a spiritual, but the one I was looking for, answer. Yeah, you might think the Magi, you might think the star, you might think the journey, but I think about the gifts, the gold, the frankincense, the myrrh. And they are, I think, in many ways, the shiny things, that you hear about and that you focus on. And I've heard sermons, excellent sermons, more eisegetical than exegetical, Canon Bill, about the meaning of the gifts and the focus on these things. But I think, as our first reading sets us up to think about, the riches of God, when we think about the riches of God, the first things that come to mind shouldn't necessarily be the shiny things, shouldn't necessarily be the gold or the frankincense or the myrrh or the beautiful architecture or the glorious works of art. They're wonderful. They're beautiful. They can aid us in our journey of faith. But if we think that that's all that there is to the riches of God, then I think we're going to miss out what is really important about the Epiphany, what is really important about the coming of the Magi. And so I want to look at what Paul wrote to the Ephesians, think about that a little bit, and see how Paul talks about these other kinds of riches. He talks about the boundless riches of Christ, which are seen in the revelation of a mystery that had been hidden. We'll talk about that during coffee hour, but has now been revealed. And that mystery is that God's plan for the world is not limited to a small select group of people, but is in fact inclusive of everyone. The Gentiles, those barbaric people, God has all along wanted to bring into the family. The riches of Christ are not bound to a particular group, they are, in fact, boundless. And I think that's important for us to remember, because sometimes, not wholly wrongly, when we think about the riches of Christ, we think about the blessings that we might experience in our life, and that's lovely. But if all we think about when we think about the riches of Christ are what God can do for me, then I think we're missing the boundless picture that Paul wants to paint for us of what God is up to in the world. God's grace is an inclusive grace, not an exclusive grace. It is not that we say, we have received and all of you are out of luck. It is that we have received so that you can receive, so that we all can receive the grace of God. Now, I don't think any of us here tonight would have too much of a problem with the inclusion of the Gentiles into the church, right? Because I think that's all of us, right? I don't know that to be true 100%, but that's most of us, yes? Certainly, some of my Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, whatever it is we were Gentiles through and through. And so it's not controversial for me to say, that group of people, they're allowed. But boy, oh boy, have we not done an excellent job in the history of the church picking out other groups of people and saying, you, shoo. You're not invited here. God's grace isn't for you. It's only for us. If we look around, there are plenty of excluded communities in our world today. And I think if Paul were writing to the church in Scranton, Pennsylvania, he might say, hey, remember that Christ's riches are boundless, not bounded. But that's not the only reference to riches that we find in this section of the book of Ephesians. There is also a richness that Paul talks about to the wisdom of God, and tasks the church with sharing that wisdom with the world in all of its rich variety. Some religious traditions, we won't name them, but you can think of them in your minds judgmentally, like to say the truth is this, and any other opinion, I'll say this in a literal theological sense, to hell with them. If you don't believe exactly like we do, you're out. I think Paul would say to them, there is a rich variety of wisdom that God has for us. After all, truth in the biblical sense is known not intellectually as propositions, but is known experientially as a relationship. And we know that if truth is more about a relationship to the divine than it is getting A, B, and C right, then we will recognize that every relationship is a little bit different. Think about all of the people you have relationships with in your life. You relate to every single one of them a little bit differently. And so I think that's what Paul is getting at. That the wisdom of God is variegated. Is that a word? Variegated? When I'm looking for wisdom, I look up here. Is that a word, variegated?
It is a word.
It is a word? If we used it in Scrabble, it would be okay? I know, there's wisdom here too. I should just go, no, we won't go there. It's a variegated wisdom. Wisdom, if we want to think about it more richly, if you will, in the biblical context, for the Hebrew people, was about knowing how to live your life wisely. Knowing how to live your life well. And I think the important thing for us to think about when we think about the richness of the wisdom of God in terms of how do I live my life well, is that the answer to that question is just as varied as any other question. And so sometimes we think, what do I do? What should I do? There's only one right answer. And if I don't get that answer right, every other choice that I make is wrong. And I think that's not a very healthy way of thinking. I think there is a richness in the way that we can live our lives. Well, there's a richness certainly because of the diversity of the kind of people that we have all around us, and there's a richness because God's path for us is not a rigid one. Too many people have grown too discouraged because they have thought that there is only one straight and narrow, and if I move this way or that, I'll fall off the path. I know Jesus says narrow is the path, but there's space even in that narrow path for some diversity of choice. And so I think that this choice of second reading is perfect for Epiphany. Have you figured out why, or at least why I think that is? Well, where did the wise men come from? The East. They were maybe, probably, possibly not Jewish, but Gentile. When we look at the scene, we see Jewish persons and we see Gentiles. And the path that they took varied. Sure, there was a star to lead them, but once they had reached Bethlehem and found out what Herod was up to, they changed their minds. And rather than turning right, they turned left. Because there is space there. Dare I say, it's going to rhyme, so it's going to sound silly, but there is some space there for, you figure out the word? Grace. And on that silly note, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.